Missile strikes in Syria, a new red line from the new commander-in-chief.
It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
Russia is mad, Iran too, and in Congress, a debate over war powers and what comes next.
There is no legal justification for this. Does the Constitution matter?
Plus, trouble for the Trump agenda and more turmoil in the Trump White House. More and more a family business.
Where I disagree with my father, he knows it, and I express myself with total candor.
Inside Politics, the biggest stories sourced by the best reporters now. Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm John King. To our viewers in the United States and around the world, thanks for sharing your Sunday. A lot to talk about, including more evidence of West Wing staff turmoil and a new show of U.S. military muscle in Asia aimed at getting North Korea's attention. But let's begin with this. Being commander-in-chief is changing a man who for years said it was foolish to inject American power into Syria's civil war.
Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types.
Now, these are the images that changed the president's minds. Victim of a sarin gas attack the Pentagon says was launched by Bashar al-Assad. And these here, let's take a look. These are the images of the message sent by the president in the form of 60 cruise missiles, 59 of them aimed at the Al-Shayrat. 50 of them hit their targets at the Al-Shayrat air base. The red dots show you some of the damage. Let me bring out to show you more closely. Aircraft hangars here, hardened shelters for aircraft. You see these photos released by the Pentagon show some of the destruction there. That's one example of the destruction we see from the cruise missiles. Again, come over here, you see much of the same. Burnt out areas here, the hardened shelters. You can see the pockmarks where the missiles went in. Again, the President of the United States trying to send a message to Bashar al-Assad, to Syria, and to Moscow. The question now is, was this a one-time retaliation, or is the United States on a new war footing?
He won't stop here. If he needs to do more, he will do more. So really now what happens depends on how everyone responds to what happened in Syria, and make sure that we start moving towards a political solution and we start finding peace in that area.
With us this Sunday to share their reporting and their insights, Julie Pace of the Associated Press, CNN's Phil Mattingly, Perry Bacon of 538, and The Atlantic's Molly Ball. The first major military assault of the Trump presidency was a plan initially drawn up for President Obama, but kept on the shelf until Thursday.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
Now, the fallout is complicated, to say the least. Russia has dispatched a cruise missile ship of its own to Syria to show its displeasure. Russian television yesterday making a point of showing the targeted airbase was back in business. What next is the big question. And the Trump administration is sending mixed signals. You heard in the beginning of the program there Nikki Haley saying if he has to do more, he will do more. The Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, seems to be saying, let's just see what happens on the ground. Our big fundamental policy hasn't changed. This is more about ISIS than it is about Bashar al-Assad. Which is it?
Well, you're right. They're sending mixed messages. I was with the president and the White House staff in Palm Beach the last few days, and on the one hand, you would hear officials say that Trump is willing to do more to go after Assad. At the same time, they say that there's no broader shift in U.S. policy. And I think that what we can take away from this is that the strike was meant to send a message that Trump is a president who is willing to use military action when he feels necessary, but that they have not really thought through what this means more broadly. And I think that leaves them in a potentially dangerous situation because the Assad regime doesn't have much to lose here. And Russia and Iran have shown a great capacity for trying to prop Assad up over the last several years.
And a red line certainly drawn by this president about the use of chemical weapons. President Obama drew that line, didn't enforce it when it was crossed. This president clearly has. But do we know what happens if next week Bashar al-Assad uses conventional weapons and bombs a town again? And we see pictures, horror, not chemical reactions, but still horror, still death, still children, still babies. Is that okay because it's not gas?
What he said was that they are lines of many colors. In fact, there are many different kinds of lines that were crossed. So, as Julie was saying, the administration officials are almost explicitly saying they do not have an end game. They do not have a broader strategy. This isn't part of something that has been thought all the way through. It is a one-time thing that might turn into a many-times thing. And if it doesn't change U.S. policy, it is a direct contravention of what Trump consistently, what his stance was throughout the campaign on this issue. So the reason the previous administration took the public relations hit of Obama looking weak and feckless and being broadly criticized for not being forceful enough on Syria, they decided that that was still preferable to potentially being drawn into a quagmire, potentially being drawn into a broader war that would require troop commitment that we couldn't get out of, that would make the situation worse. And this administration doesn't have answers to those questions of how you avoid those outcomes.
And whether it's a one-off or not, you've still thrown a punch at Bashar al-Assad, the first time the United States has directly attacked the regime. At the same time, you have special operations forces and others inside Syria helping the fight against ISIS. So you have two enemies, if you will, now, two combatants within the borders in Syria. This is a complicated one. Without a clear policy, where are we going?
And as you said earlier, the mixed message is Nikki Haley today said something along the lines of Assad can't be part of the solution there, which is a strong statement, closer to the he must go language Obama used, but we don't have that from Tillerson's and other things as well. So it's not clear what the policy is toward Assad. Are we trying to push him out? What are we doing there either? So again, we don't know. We took one step here on Thursday. I'm not sure what the next two steps are even.
Well, let's do that a little bit. Let's ask something. Here's Nikki Haley, and you want to stay with CNN. She's on State of the Union with Jake Tapper next hour. Listen to her on the fundamental question. You just launched this military strike. Is this president's goal now that Bashar al-Assad is a policy that Bashar al-Assad must go?
Well, the regime change is something that we think is going to happen because all of the parties are going to see that Assad's not the leader that needs to be taking place for Syria.
That's the United Nations ambassador, works for Donald Trump. Here's the Secretary of State, who has the same boss.
There is no real change in the United States military stance towards Syria from what it was last week.
That's correct, George. This strike, I think the president was very clear in his message to the American people that this strike was related solely to the most recent horrific use of chemical weapons against women, children, and as the president said, even small babies. We are asking Russia to fulfill its commitment, and we're asking and calling on Bashar al-Assad to cease the use of these weapons. Other than that, there is no change to our military posture.
Is confusion a strategy, or is confusion just because there's a lack? The last administration went through this, as Molly just said. There are no good options here.
Yeah, everybody's on the same page, clearly, on this. No, look, I think that what Julie and Molly and Perry kind of all laid out is just the reality right now. They don't know necessarily what's coming next. They haven't had kind of the in-depth policy discussions / planning on what they want to do with Syria going forward. There's been so much going on in the first 75 days that I haven't gotten the sense that those meetings have at least happened at the top-line principal level. And that raises a lot of questions. I was on Capitol Hill when Major General Dunford came in and briefed senators in a closed-door, secure briefing after the strikes came out. All of them came out and said, look, the briefing was fantastic. The lead-up into this decision-making was very good, as traditional as you could expect, and we are all very impressed. Nobody had any answers to what comes next. And it's what you heard repeatedly. The reviews were good. We heard from allies. We heard from senators on both sides of the aisle. Everybody was pleased that the Trump administration was willing to take this step. But nobody knows what happens next. And what happens next is not just on the military side of things. It's on the diplomatic side of things. It's how we're working with allies, all of those things. And there just aren't answers there yet, at least that any of us have heard.
It's interesting. I mean, I've covered the political space around the Syria war since 2013 when Obama backed away. And you almost felt like it was this cathartic moment for a lot of people in both parties who have felt so frustrated that the U.S. hasn't done more. So this just the mere fact that Trump was willing to take this action, I think, in the short term made people feel pretty good. But very quickly, you've seen that start to fade away a little bit, because this is not only the same complicated situation with Assad. This is that situation with ISIS and Russia then layered on top of it. We're now in a much more difficult situation in Syria than we were when Obama was making this decision in 2013.
But unpredictability is and always has been a Trump calling card. And now you have the Secretary of State going to Moscow this week to see the foreign minister. What are the Russians thinking about this? You had we're going to get to this in a minute, the summit with China, and now military ships going toward North Korea. What are they thinking about this in Beijing and Pyongyang? One thing we do know is that what the president decided to do was 180 degrees apart from what for years he said the United States should do.
If Assad got knocked off, let's say they get knocked off, he gets knocked off, what do we have? I mean, we don't know if it's going to be worse than Assad. So what are we doing? I think it's irresponsible for us to get bogged down in Syria, and maybe let's end up with World War III over Syria, where we don't even want to be in the first place.
Now, they insist we're not going to get bogged down. They insist this was a one-time response to a horrific act by the Syrian regime. But the president's letter to Congress explaining himself and saying he has legal justification for this says, if I have to, I'll do it again. And so what did we learn about our president? Every candidate becomes president and has to leave something behind. Sometimes they leave a lot of things behind because they just realize, okay, this job isn't what I thought it was. It's much easier to run for president than to be president. Is that what this is?
Yeah, I think this is a major clarifying moment, perhaps the first real testing moment for Donald Trump, because his presidency was always going to be determined by events he couldn't control and how he responded to them, how he answered, how he made decisions when he had to. On the campaign trail, he often took both sides of an issue, right? You did have people with selective hearing thinking, oh, he's an isolationist, he's even sort of a peacenik, he talks about being against the war in Iraq, although that's questionable. People with selective hearing on the other side hearing him say we're going to bomb the you-know-what out of ISIS and we're going to be militaristic and tough and strong and putting in all the generals. And when in a campaign, you can say both things and have people hear what they want to hear. When the rubber hits the road and you have to make a policy decision and it has to be one thing or the other thing, that's how you figure out what kind of president someone is.
And now he has stepped in this. Again, they think it's a one-off. They hope it's a one-off, but he has stepped in this. On Capitol Hill, you hear from the Hawks who say we have to do more. We might need some more troops over there. We need to do more to help the resistance. From the Democrats, listen to Hillary Clinton here. She says, thank you, Mr. President. I applaud you for doing this. But
I hope this administration will move forward in a way that is both strategic and consistent with our values. And I also hope that they will recognize that we cannot in one breath speak of protecting Syrian babies and in the next close America's doors to them.
Her case is, Mr. President, now you have a moral obligation to stop your refugee ban, to let Syrian refugees come in. Anyone want to bet that's going to happen?
I don't think that's something. It's an important statement that Hillary made, too. And we saw that about 79 senators, by our count, supported this individual strike. So that's actually a big majority of people. That said, when you got to any questions beyond that, you saw lots of division about what do we do about Assad, what do we do about refugees. So I think she's speaking to a broader view here. Just one policy was agreed upon, but there's going to be a big fight after that. And Trump maybe clarified that he will not abide by his campaign rhetoric, but it's still, if your doctrine is no doctrine, if your doctrine is I'm flexible, that's not something people can act upon. It's very unclear what it means you're going to do in the next fight.
Although we do know this is now front and center on his mind. We'll see how this develops. Everyone sit tight. Ahead, some major turmoil at the top of Team Trump. And next, another giant and important policy shift. Candidate Trump casts China as an enemy. President Trump appears to have a new friend. And this week's Politicians Say the Darndest Things, Saturday Night Live's take on the Syrian missile strikes.
We all love Trump, don't we? We do. I just had an amazing week, folks. I met with leaders from China, Egypt, and Jordan. Gorsuch was confirmed. The media is saying nice things, and no one is talking about Russia. Well, what a difference just 59 Tomahawk missiles can make.
But 2 days of talks in Florida included, yes, a fancy dinner between the two leaders, vague but quite positive statements about trying to work together on economic and security challenges, and a very, very different tone from President Trump.
The relationship developed by President Xi and myself, I think, is outstanding. We look forward to being together many times in the future. And I believe lots of very potentially bad problems will be going away.
A lot of potentially bad problems will be going away. we've gotten the readouts from both sides. The readouts from both sides, and this is not unusual, especially when it comes to China. The readouts from both sides are very general, that they talk bluntly, they talk candidly, they talk frankly, they built a good personal relationship. And from the White House side, they're saying they look forward to Chinese actions on economic issues. And let's start with the security issues, because normally a U.S. Navy carrier group starts steaming toward the Korean Peninsula and China screams, stay out of our neighborhood. We haven't heard that yet. Let's see what happens over the next several days. That in and of itself could be progress out of this summit. But does the White House say anything? Did they get anything tangible on the ask that we need Beijing, we need you to go to talk to Pyongyang and get him to stop?
At least what we're hearing right now, no, they didn't, though they did get what they call a commitment from China to work with the U.S. on this problem, the security problem, the economic problem. I think, this meeting was so interesting because it was framed as generally an introductory meeting. This is the first time that these two men have met before. It's an incredibly complicated relationship between their two countries, made even more complicated by the fact that Trump was so aggressive during his campaign about China. And also, though, you heard after the Syria strike that the White House was basically owning the idea that the other message that the strike sent was to China to say, we have asked you for your help on North Korea. We want you to exert more economic pressure, but this is a president who is willing to act alone. And if you don't believe him, look at what he just did in Syria, regardless of what Russia and Iran were saying.
And I assume sending the carrier group, and I assume they gave the Chinese a heads up about this. I assume that's an exclamation point to that we're going to put these assets in the region. We have told North Korea we're not going to negotiate anymore. We've told you to stop testing your missiles, and North Korea ignores that and keeps testing its missiles. This is Senator John McCain on his view. Yes, the Middle East is a mess, but John McCain's view on the #1 strategic challenge for the United States heading into the China summit.
The most immediate crisis we have is not in the Middle East. The most immediate crisis right now is this crazy fat kid, and I know we were in, who is honest. He is not rational. Everything I read about him, he's not rational. What's the worst kind of adversary would be an irrational person with a nuclear weapon. So I would hope that the meetings with the Chinese leader, who is now going through the process of consolidating his position, would be that he would take sufficient action against North Korea to stop us. They can do it.
Senator McCain amuses himself with what he thinks are funny turns of phrase, using the term fat kid there. But this is, and President Obama told this to President Trump on the way out. Wherever you're looking in the world, this is the one that's going to come back to get you.
There's no question about it. And I think there has been a noticeable shift in how the Trump administration handles this issue. The Obama administration for years was working behind closed doors with China to try and deal with Pyongyang. And they made very clear they weren't going to attack them publicly. They weren't going to label them a currency manipulator. A lot of the things that they were doing on the economic side of things were because of back channel negotiations with China to try and keep the relationship open, to try and work with them to kind of persuade them, hey, we're not going to do this if you help us behind the scenes here. It's very clear the Trump administration has made the calculation, either because of their experts or because of the president himself, that that wasn't the proper course of action, and they're going to change that. I think the big question now becomes, what actions do we see after the fact, right? Like, what is China going to do that's tangible, that's noticeable, that they can bring to the table, the Trump administration can say, our tact, our strategy is working. You can see the reaction that's happening in Beijing, and it's having a noticeable impact on Pyongyang, because there hasn't been any evidence of that up to this point.
Yeah, and as we watch, and I think the next few days will be critical in terms of Beijing's, whether it interacts with North Korea, as you see the Navy carrier group heading that way. That's on the security front. On the economic front, if you listen to Trump during the campaign, and there's no secret, his message on trade, his message on blue-collar economics, America first, that's why Wisconsin, that's why Michigan, that's why Pennsylvania turned from blue to red. Listen to Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader of the United States Senate, here saying, Mr. President, what happened to those tough promises on China trade?
Since Donald Trump has become president, when it comes to trade, his policies make America look like a 98-pound weakling. He has done virtually nothing.
That is a risk for the president, right? You get the idea, the first face-to-face meeting, you know the culture of China, you don't want to get in their face because they tend to react negatively to that, so these very positive statements. But if he does not have tangibles to show 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year from now on this economic trade front from China, there's a risk, is there not?
Sure. I mean, China trade was so central to his campaign, and if you believed the Donald Trump of the campaign trail, this is one of the things he was very consistent about. You would have believed that he would have slapped a tariff on day one. Now, he did retract the TPP, which never went into effect in the first place, but that was a significant action that did fulfill his campaign promise. But beyond
but
that,
in an odd way actually helps China because it was the other countries sort
Right.
of in the region organizing against China.
And he hasn't ripped up NAFTA. He hasn't done a lot. He hasn't slapped a tariff on Mexico. For a while, there was a sort of backdoor tariff that was going to be part of the House tax plan, and now we hear that may also be dead. So if to your point, if the Trump that you voted for was the Trump who was going to get in there aggressively, smash the niceties of diplomacy, make that call to Taiwan no matter what anybody said was the right protocol, this is a very different and potentially more presidential-looking Trump. That's probably comforting to people who didn't want a complete disruption of all of our diplomatic institutions, but maybe disconcerting to people who were hoping that as a non-politician, he would actually break some proverbial China.
Right, certainly a more establishment-looking Trump as we go forward. Everybody hang tight. Next, rumblings of a possible White House staff shakeup as the president's top 3 aides meet to see if they can move past constant infighting and constant policy differences. First, I want to update you on some breaking news out of North Africa. Sad breaking news. Multiple explosions in Egypt this morning, where tragedy is overshadowing one of the holiest days of the year. At least 11 people are dead after a bombing at a church in Alexandria during a Palm Sunday service. Local media says the head of Egypt's Coptic church was inside the church when that blast happened. Just hours before that, more than 24 people killed in a church bombing in Tanta, that's north of Cairo. Video from inside the church shows the moment the explosion happened. We want to warn you, it may be hard to watch. Security teams are on the site of both of those bombings, digging through debris, looking for survivors. We'll keep that story. We'll keep you updated on that story as the day progresses. Now, the big U.S.-China summit wasn't the only difficult diplomacy at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in recent days. Friday night, a 45-minute attempt at peacemaking, or at least détente, between 3 top members of the Trump West Wing: Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, and presidential son-in-law and jack of all trades, Jared Kushner. It is not the first time these 3 have had to talk things out. And while the president was aware of the meeting and we are told he encouraged it, there's still talk bubbling that perhaps a staff shakeup, or at least a staff realignment, might be in the works. What's going on here? Chaos was a trademark of the Trump campaign. We are now a couple of weeks from the 100-day mark, and we continue to hear that the chief of staff isn't really running the White House, that the chief strategist is mad. Some days he's having a big week, other weeks he seems to be being pushed out, that the president increasingly is turning to his son-in-law because he trusts him. Where's the power center?
It changes week to week, almost day to day. It's almost exhausting to try to keep up with the, who's up, who's down in this White House right now. I think the most important thing to know, and the reason that these stories actually matter, is because this comes from the top. This is a president who, on the one hand, encourages chaos. He often will pit advisors against each other, try to make them compete. He believes that that is a recipe for success. On the other hand, he's a president who is very aware of his coverage, very aware of how moment-to-moment decisions are playing out. And he recognizes as much as anybody that things have not been going well, that he is not off to a successful start. So he is really trying to figure out what the formula is internally that can get this operation back on track. Someone like Jared Kushner, he has an inevitable advantage because he is the president's son-in-law, yet he comes politically from a much different position than some of these other people who helped Trump win the campaign. And so Trump is drawn to them because of the success of the campaign, because of the connection to the base. So this will ultimately be up to the president to decide. And again, it changes almost day to day.
But you see in the personnel the very same things we see in the policy fights, whether it's health care, whether it's tax reform, that you have an establishment guy in Reince Priebus, let's cut the best deal. You have the America First populist in Steve Bannon, who says establishment be damned and we don't trust you, even if you're the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Jared Kushner, who Steve Bannon apparently tells his friends, he thinks, well, he's a Democrat, and why do we have a Democrat in a Republican White House?
Yeah, and it goes even deeper than that. If you look at kind of how everything's segmented off here, you have Gary Cohn, who's by far the top economic voice inside the administration, who was a former Democrat and aligns with Jared Kushner on a regular basis. Dina Powell, also a former finance Wall Street individual who kind of lines up with them as well, who's a deputy national security advisor. And so you have these teams kind of form here. And I think the interesting element that I've been kind of watching through is the who's up, who's down on a daily basis. Starting in like the second week of January, K Street was talking about how Gary Cohn was soon going to replace Reince Priebus as chief of staff. That stuff happens every single day. And in terms of the ability of a West Wing to operate functionally, knowing that not only is everybody talking about the changes that are coming, but a lot of it's coming from inside the West Wing. That's extremely difficult in terms of an environment to actually work when you have all of these huge issues that they're dealing with.
And it's a so what, who cares if you're getting things done. Right. If you're getting things done and the president likes this way, okay, whatever. But the Obamacare repeal and replace effort failed. They're nowhere on putting a tax reform plan on paper. They keep talking about infrastructure, but they don't have a plan to go before Congress, and they'll have these same ideological fights, not only within their own team, but on Capitol Hill as well. So some people talk, and the president apparently, when he calls his friends, says, what do you think of my team? How are they doing? You have any suggestions for me? There's still talk, even though the White House the other night tried to say, no, the president told these guys, get it together. So will there be a shakeup? The White House says no. Listen to Kellyanne Conway, the president's counselor.
Is Bannon there to stay? Is Reince Priebus there to stay?
I would assume so. That's up to Donald Trump. In other words, I've heard nothing but rumors and innuendos and press reports that would make any of us believe that anything other than the real shakeup going on in Washington is the way Donald Trump is coming in as a disruptor.
You got that?
Well, it's sort of remarkably honest, right? Her saying, like, I have no idea. Right. And the only person who knows this is Donald Trump 5 minutes before he announces his decision. Right. So, but, you know.
She has some history here, having gone out there saying he had full confidence in Michael Flynn right before his national security advisor was shown the door.
Well, and so, but I think, as you were sort of saying, the upshot of all this is gridlock. Because there is no clear direction coming out of the White House, because Trump has not chosen a side in what are ultimately ideological fights about what direction, what public stance the White House is going to take, and what kind of leadership they're going to exert on, and even what their major things are that they want to get done. He's sort of been all over the place on that. And that has meant that they are at the mercy of the same old Republican divisions in Congress. They are at the mercy of the sort of Keystone Cops operation of the leadership of the House of Representatives. That's not a good look for a president who promised to come in and start getting things done.
And we know that when he feels challenged or when he feels disappointed in the people around him, he tends to get more insular and go like he ran his business with the people he knows best. His daughter Ivanka, his son-in-law Jared, who he knows. And so you see Jared taking trips to Iraq, and a lot of people saying, what are you doing there? I thought you were in charge of Middle East peace. Didn't you just launch a new White House Office on American Innovation that's supposed to reinvent the government? So you get the Jared Kushner criticism. Ivanka Trump has also moved into the West Wing. Listen to her.
I would say not to conflate lack of public denouncement with silence. I think there are multiple ways to have your voice heard. Where I disagree with my father, he knows it, and I express myself with total candor. Where I agree, I fully lean in and support the agenda and hope that I can be an asset to him and make a positive impact. But I respect the fact that he always listens. It's how he was in business. It's how he is as president.
Now, there are some Republicans who view her as a calming force on the president. They view her as a gateway to get an idea to the president. But there are also a lot of conservatives who will remember she couldn't vote for her father in the New York primary because she's not a registered Republican.
I would say the big shift you think from November to today is it appears that Steve Bannon and his wing, where they're on foreign and domestic policy, has less power, and Jared and Ivanka have more power. And that's a big shift because, like you said, Bannon is this nationalist, more conservative, the Trump family, less conservative probably. So this is a big move. If you're a liberal, you should probably be cheering this in some ways because the family, or you're thinking them, probably are not people who are very ideologically conservative. They don't have a lot of roots to the movement on Capitol Hill or elsewhere as well. So it's a big shift, I would say, from November to today, where Bannon, who was President Bannon, according to Time magazine, I think is probably not, maybe President Kushner at this point.
But it's the establishment Republicans who are really winning. The things he's actually managed to get done, the Supreme Court, the cabinet appointments, that's straight conservative Republican.
Right, and so we'll see if we're having the same conversation next week. We'll see who's up and who's down next week, and that's one of the issues. It can be a different conversation week to week. Everyone sit tight. Next week's the 100-day mark, a big win at the Supreme Court, and a huge mess on health care. you look at it from an economic perspective, jobs added during the Trump presidency this past week was a bit of a warning sign. Only 98,000 jobs created in March. You see that down from the more robust job growth this going back to the Obama administration. 1 month or a problem in the economy? We'll keep an eye on that. Here's another way to look at it, though, and this one shines favorably on the president. The unemployment rate, not the jobs created, the unemployment rate, pop that up there, now at a 10-point low. That's a good thing for the president. If you score this all by your 401k, so far so good. A little dip recently, but so far so good for President Trump. Here's the big question at the 100-day mark. Repeal or replace Obamacare, that failed. America First economy depends on your perspective, not the tough action on trade, as we discussed, many expected. Immigration enforcement has been strengthened. The wall, a giant question mark going forward, and we don't have an infrastructure plan from the president yet, even though that was a big 100-day priority. Still, President Trump says all is fine.
We're only 11 weeks in, but already my administration has achieved historic progress for the American people. Security begins at the border. As a candidate, I pledge to take swift and decisive action to secure the border, and that is exactly what I've done.
Again, depending on what your big issue is, you look at this from your perspective, but we're 3 weeks to 100 days. Congress is home for a couple weeks of that. Let's start on the health care debate, which you have to say is a debacle. Phil, they were allegedly trying to get back to a deal this past week. Mike Pence was up there for a few days. We're going to get it. We're going to get it. Now they've gone home into the favorite thing they like, town halls. Can they possibly come back and move quickly on Obamacare repeal, or do we have to put that one away?
Look, the elements that led to the failure of the first repeal and replace 3 weeks ago haven't changed. And I think that's the biggest thing here. Look, there was a reason that Speaker Ryan and House leadership took a step back on this 2.0 effort that Vice President Pence led with several administration officials. They recognized that, one, this is incredibly difficult. Two, they didn't want to snuff anything out by kind of being overbearing. But three, and I think this is the most important, that the dynamics in the House Republican Conference when it comes to health care are extraordinarily complicated, and they can't figure out a way to thread a needle right now. So their ability to come back 3 weeks from now and all of a sudden be able to get to a deal, as one person told me, in the wake of Vice President Pence's efforts, despite their theater of the day before they left, they were further apart, had lost more votes than they had 2 weeks prior when this initially failed. They're not in a good place right now. Something needs to happen to change the very dynamics of how this conference works.
And this gets to the core of who President Trump says he is. Here's what he told the New York Times this past week. You didn't hear me say it's over. That was a negotiation. You understand? A continuing negotiation. It may go on for a long time, or it may go on until this afternoon. I don't know. It's a continuing negotiation. I didn't surrender leverage. I'm not looking to gain leverage. I'm looking to get great health care. The president trying to make the best of what was a big disappointment for him, because this was his calling card. I will get a deal. He said in his announcement speech, if you can't negotiate a deal with the politicians on Obamacare, you're not very good. So by his own standard, not very good. But one of the problems in Washington is if you continue a negotiation on health care, very complicated issue, then that sets you back when it comes to tax reform. That sets you back when it comes to infrastructure, because whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, Washington has proven it cannot do more than one big thing at a time, if it can do one big thing at all.
And the entire legislative strategy was to for both fiscal and sort of messaging reasons, to do health care first, get it knocked out, boom. And Trump made it sound very much like the symbolism of this would be, this is, the shock and awe administration that can come in and get things done right away, because look, we've got all these Republicans, we don't need any Democratic votes, we can just do the things that we've always wanted to do. Who knew that healthcare could be so complicated?
Who knew?
But the other thing about that is, that quote that you read from the Times makes it sound like he is much more engaged with this than he has seemed to be. You don't see President Trump really exerting himself to push the parties together personally. He's having his people do it, but he's not really weighing in terms of, I want this thing and not that. Here's why I think this bill didn't work. Here's the details that I want. Not only because he's not really a policy guy, and that's fine, that may be an asset, but there just doesn't seem to be a clear sense of what was wrong with the first effort and how those things can be corrected beyond just nibbling around the edges and trying to give someone something here and someone something there. Is there a vision for what they can make that's different than the last thing?
The one big victory under the Capitol dome is Neil Gorsuch, who will be sworn into the Supreme Court this week. But even that further polarized an environment that you thought couldn't be further polarized.
But that's a big victory. Put it as one of the things, it's a big victory. I would say what it tells you is he did one policy where the Republican Party is very unified on, and it went through very easily. If he picks issues maybe like a tax cut, but without all this border adjustment stuff, you might find an issue where the whole party agrees with him on.
Good luck with that one. Stay tight, sit tight. Our reporters share from their notebooks next, including the new sheriff in town when it comes to the House investigation into Russia election meddling. With reporters, not pundits, for a reason, so that we can close every week asking them to dig deep into their notebooks, share a little nugget, get you out ahead of the big political news just around the corner. Julie Pace?
Democrats are pretty desperate to win anything these days, which may help explain why a 30-year-old Democrat in a Georgia congressional special election has raised an eye-popping $8 million. John Ossoff is attracting an army of volunteers from across the country, including a lot of celebrities who are trying to get voters out in early voting in a primary there. Now, this is a district that Tom Price, the Health and Human Services Secretary, held. It's a Republican district, but it's one that Trump barely eked out in November. So for the ego boost alone, you're going to see Democrats really lavishing a lot of attention on this race through the finish line.
18th, right? The 18th. All right,
yep.
We'll watch that, Phil.
There's no secret, obviously, about the infighting that's going on in the White House, but I think the big question is, what are the repercussions of it? And if you look to Capitol Hill, you can see it. It's been laid bare over the last couple of weeks. As one very senior Republican official on Capitol Hill told me, there's no White House, there's White Houses, as in nobody knows who actually speaks for the president. And what that does for members of Congress is creates a lot of difficulties. We saw it just in a meeting last week. Reince Priebus, Vice President Pence, Paul Ryan, and Kevin McCarthy, the GOP leadership. Basically, the White House told them they had to put the health care bill on the floor. Speaker Ryan said, we can't do that. We don't have the votes. The White House basically threatened them and said, you don't know the realities here. You don't understand the politics. There's just a lot of confusion here. And you wonder where that goes from here. Well, when they get back from their 2-week recess, they'll have 4 days to pass a spending bill. I'm told there are elements in the White House right now who are willing to shut down the government to keep the wall funding in there, something that Republicans in both the Senate and House would like to move to another time. So, no solutions yet.
Dick. Okay, 4 fun days ahead. Perry?
The man to watch on Capitol Hill, Mike Conaway of Texas. You hadn't heard of him much before, but now that he's replacing Devin Nunes as the head of the Russia investigation, he's a big figure to watch. The key question is, does he run the committee as Nunes did? Nunes was on Trump's transition committee, was pretty favorable toward Trump in a lot of ways. And does Conaway run the committee that way, or does he run it the way Richard Burr is running in the Senate, which has been more bipartisan, more interested in working with Democrats?
We'll keep an eye on how often he pops up at the stakeout camera. That'll give us our first clue. Molly?
What is next for the resistance? There have been some questions lately about whether the air has sort of gone out of the balloon of the anti-Trump protests and the left's attempts to mobilize against the new president. They are trying now that the Congress is on recess to mount a new show of force, a number of progressive groups all coordinating. There will be efforts to show that people are still coming to town halls, still angry at their members of Congress who are home in their districts for the next 2 weeks, but also a coordinated march on Tax Day, April 15th, next weekend, which has a number of sort of storylines, I guess. One, to continue drawing attention to the issue of Trump's taxes and potential conflicts of interest. 2, to spotlight the tax reform plans in Congress. And 3, this may seem a little far-fetched, but to try to take back the tax issue. It's traditionally been more of an issue on the right, and to consciously go the Tea Party, which did the big tax day marches back in 2009. But the big thing, I think, is we will see by how many people come out. They're doing this in hundreds of cities plus D.C. Are they going to get those mass numbers, or are people starting to lose interest?
We'll keep an eye on that one as we go. I'll close with this. It's no secret that the Shark Tank celebrity and Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban likes to poke at President Trump. He also likes to stoke talk of possibly running for president himself. Now, Cuban campaigned, you probably remember, for Hillary Clinton last year, and he's become a student of the process of running for president. Cuban is an independent, and while Bernie Sanders is proof that isn't necessarily disqualifying to Democratic primary voters, Cuban now is putting some money where his mouth is, you might say. He's giving financial support to a group called Competitive Democracy, which won a big legal case in Pennsylvania last year aimed at making ballot access easier for independent and minor party candidates. That group is now working on ballot reforms in Texas, and in part because of Cuban's financial support, is looking to be more aggressive in ballot reform efforts elsewhere. Keep an eye on that one. That's it for Inside Politics. Again, thanks for sharing your Sunday morning. Remember, IP is also on the air weekdays at noon Eastern. Hope to see you then. Up next, the United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley joins State of the Union with Jake Tapper.